When it comes to financing expenditures, the government has several tools that it can use to finance those expenditures. Taxation is one of them. In this video, we will see that taxation may also be used to influence behavior of the consumers. So to illustrate how taxation can have an impact on people's behavior, I'm just going to go through a simple example. Imagine that you are currently buying a certain good, whatever it may be, food or a product, for $10. And that you've been consuming this good every week, and all of a sudden the government decides to impose a tax on it. And it imposes a really high tax on it. This good that used to buy for $10 is now $20. They put 100% tax on it. Well, you keep consuming as much as before. It's possible that you may keep consuming a certain amount. You may even keep consuming the same amount as before, but likely you're going to reduce your consumption or you're going to stop consuming altogether. And the reason for that is that if you think about what determined how many units you would consume in the past, well, it's based on your satisfaction, your willingness to pay, how much you feel this good is worth, and on the price. And if your satisfaction for buying this good is greater than the price, well, you buy it. But all of a sudden, your desire for this product, the product hasn't changed in quality. It's the same product as before, but all of a sudden, it's double the price. Therefore, your satisfaction shouldn't change, your willingness to pay of owning, consuming this product, but the price did. And if the price is now greater than your willingness to pay for that unit, you will not buy it. You might buy 1 unit instead of 5 units because that first unit you still have a high willingness to pay, but you will not buy as much as before, for sure. But the caveat to all of this is you need to understand what are your options. So there's certain goods out there that you will buy much less of it, and other goods, your behavior may not change that much. So for the people who own the car during the pandemic and at the end of the pandemic when we had the war in Ukraine, a lot of those people noticed that the price of gasoline shot up. It practically doubled in a certain time frame. And if you would have said to those people beforehand, before this event happened, how would you consume gasoline if prices were to double? A lot of people would say, I'm going to consume a lot less gasoline, like there's no way I'm paying that price. But then when the price rises due to all of these external factors, most people I know drove almost as much as before. They still lived far from work, they still owned the same car, they still went on weekend trips. Nothing really changed all that much. And the reason for that is that this good, this gasoline, has very few substitutes. So increasing the price does not necessarily mean that you're going to decrease the quantity of this unit sold. So if you go back to the concept of elasticity, which is a concept that's covered in microeconomics, could be dry for some people, it has a lot of really interesting conclusions. If a good is inelastic, it barely changes, and your quantity demand, it barely changes to different price levels because there's no substitutes or very few substitutes around. Well, increasing the price through taxation will not have a major impact on your consumption of gasoline or consumption of that product. And it's something that policymakers need to understand, this idea of how will people respond. And to make people respond well, there needs to be alternatives. So in this context right now, we have price of gasoline went up drastically. A lot of people would have wanted to switch to electric cars, but there were just not many electric cars available. So because of that, they didn't really have other options. And an article that I'm going to share with you guys, it looks at different countries' price elasticity demand in the short run and in the long run. And something that you're going to notice is that people are much more elastic. Their behavior, their consumption changes more to a given change in price over a longer period of time than over a shorter period of time. Why do you think that's the case? Well, that's going to be a discussion that we're going to have in class. But there's a really good understanding of why that's the case, and you should think about it, and you should try to figure out why there's a disconnect between short-run price elasticity demand and long-run price elasticity demand. The greater the number, the more people respond. So if you have a number of 0.1 or 0.3, well, 0.1 says that for every 10% increase in price, you'll have a 1% drop in quantity demanded, whereas a 0.3 would be for the same 10% increase in price, you'd have a 3% decrease in quantity demanded. So there's going to be a greater impact over time. Think about substitution. Think about how you would behave, maybe now at $2, but imagine it's $4 or $6 or whatever. How would you change your behavior over time? Would it be different than how you would change it in the very short run? So we have to understand this when developing policies. We have to understand how people react. If our goal is to limit the amount of spending on a certain good that is bad for the environment, that pollutes, we have to understand, well, if we impose a tax on this, will there be alternatives so that people can go to that? Because the reason why a tax leads to less consumption, it's one, people have less money, but also you're changing the relative price. As soon as something's more expensive and the other product that could be a substitute hasn't changed in price, well, you have a situation where people will see this good as now being relatively cheaper. If all of a sudden the price of wood doubles, triples, quadruples, well, people who are building houses will look at alternatives to building with wood, because all of those products, if they haven't changed in price, will seem cheaper all of a sudden. So that's what we're trying to do when we're using taxation to influence behavior. We're trying to change the relative price between this dirty good and this other clean good, and making the clean good more appealing. So if you have a good that's very polluting in its production, it could be like different goods that use a lot of chemicals, fast fashion and whatnot. If those goods are poor for the environment or very pollutive, if we can tax them, or we can create a way for people to consume them less in favor of a more long-lasting product that's better for the environment, it's a better situation. So keep that in mind. We're going to look at different elasticity levels, different ways that people respond. But at the end of the day, taxation may be used to generate tax revenue, but it can also be used to influence behavior. And in the case of environmental taxation, climate change, carbon taxes, those things are mainly used to influence behavior. Some people would argue saying, well, the government's just putting a carbon tax to generate more money. They just want to take all our money away. Yeah, you sometimes hear that argument by some people. But at the end of the day, the government's not imposing a carbon tax to fuel more expenditures and just to spend more money on lavish things for themselves. If we have a higher carbon tax that's generating more money, the government has the option of either one, reducing income taxes because it doesn't need that revenue anymore since it's getting revenue elsewhere, which is a good thing because income taxes actually makes you want to work less because every hour you work, you owe a certain amount of money to the government. So if that tax is lower, you're going to have more incentive to work more. So it's a bad kind of tax in a certain way because it distorts people from working. And the alternative, though, could be that they use that money to finance certain expenditures that are good for the environment. So different subsidies for electric cars and whatnot. And at the same time, if I think of subsidization of cars, electric cars, we always have to keep in mind the context that we're in. So in this kind of pandemic phase where we had many supply chains disrupted, to increase the amount of subsidization on electric cars was not necessarily the best move if we think about it in terms of what can the government do to have a good impact in the economy? It might look good, but it's kind of useless. If you're going to give people money, discounts on buying electric cars when there's none available, how is that helpful? In a situation in the past where there was a lot of electric cars available, it made sense to increase subsidization to have people buy more. And it's okay to maintain some of those subsidies to keep an appeal towards electric cars. But to increase it in a situation where there's just no cars available, well, then you have a situation where a lot of people will want those electric cars. A lot of people will be lining up. Therefore, the reservation list of Teslas and all the other brands will be super high. These brands notice that there's just so much demand for their cars, they could easily increase the price. So at the end of the day, the consumer is not necessarily paying less with this extra subsidy. It's just more money going to the manufacturer. So it's something you have to watch out. You have to understand the whole context. Does the subsidization will actually lead to an increase in quantities sold? Similarly to this, will this taxation actually reduce the amount of units sold or purchase of gasoline? So we have to look at this whole context. It's not cut and dry to say that you impose a tax on this and there's going to be a lot less consumption. If there's an alternative, it's the simplest way. So if you can have a clean fuel and a dirty fuel, and they're developing now more and more clean fuels for flying, fuels that emit much less emissions and are more environmentally friendly, well, if you have this clean alternative and this dirty alternative, well, now it makes sense to start imposing a tax here and maybe adding a subsidy over here so that people switch from the dirty to the clean. So always keep that in mind when you're going to be developing policies, that you want to make sure that there is a backdoor. There is an alternative available if you want really people to change their behavior. Otherwise, you're going to be promoting potentially people changing their behavior, not in terms of what cars that they can own, but how they drive. And we'll get into that a little bit more in the future. So that's why there's a difference between short run and long run. We'll discuss that in class and you'll see. So looking forward to talking more about taxation and all of its little intricacies in class with you guys and through your assignment. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing or joining my class where I guide you to apply and expand on the information found in these videos to real life examples. Have a good day.